Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and for this week. As we acknowledge the pain and emotions from the recent and historic violence against Black people, this is a moment of great urgency, and it's an opportunity for us to seize this moment for positive change. As storytellers, as family members, as citizens, and as friends. Although racial injustice is not new, it is newly visible. We all want to learn and understand how to play a role in confronting racial injustice in our lives and our work. This week, you will hear from our team of researchers and colleagues, all of whom have deep experience with these issues. They will provide us with resources and tools and perspective. And we hope that will be of great benefit to all of you who want to take actions. I have a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our first group of researchers. We have Hope Simon, who is joining us for signing. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with Zoom, you would have to select the gallery view so that you could see Hope. So I just want to make a note of that. Also, the chat feature is turned off, but please post your questions in the Q&A. And because we have such a wonderful turnout, thank you so much. If we can't get to your question, we will follow up with you probably with an email to be able to get you your answer. And then, as I mentioned, we are going to provide you with resources and tools and readings, and we will be sending that an email to all of you with these additional resources on the day's topic. So today's session is on why social movements matter, and it's led by two of our members of our Institute's research team. So I'm first going to introduce Ninochka McTaggart, who is a senior researcher with the Institute. She holds her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Riverdale. And of course, Carolyn Heldman, who is our Vice President of Research and Insights. We call her the goddess of research. And she is also a professor in the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice at Occidental College. Please take it away, Nash and Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeline. And thank you all of the participants who are joining us today for the first day of a 5-day training. And we hope that you will join us for each and every day of these trainings as they build on one another. You may have noticed that here at the Institute in the past 5 years, we have expanded the identities that we are looking at in terms of representation in media. So we now, as a matter of course, look at 6 different identities and their intersections. So we're looking at gender, race, we're looking at LGBTQ+ status of characters, disability status. We are also looking at characters' age with a focus on characters who are 50+, because that's where ageism tends to come into play. And we're also looking at representations of body size with a focus on large body types. So we have a deep commitment to researching this issue, but what we also bring to the table is that many of us are involved in social justice work and research and scholarship pertaining to identities beyond gender. So for example, I run an intersectionality project where I look at systems of power, specifically looking at gender, race, and sexuality. My co-presenter today, Dr. McTaggart, recently published a book called White Privilege, The Persistence of Racial Hierarchy in a Culture of Denial. And so we saw this as a unique opportunity to bring all of our scholarship and our different interests to bear on this question of what we do now in this moment. And so what we've done is we have curated a week of teach-ins that build on one another. So today we'll be talking about why social movements matter with a focus on the Black Lives Matter movement. But tomorrow we will be doing a deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history of race and gender codes and how that actually structures much of the content we see today. On Wednesday, Soraya Jacardi and Romeo Perez, two members of our research team, will be doing a deep dive into the research on how representations impact human beings in attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors with a focus on racial representations. And then on Thursday and Friday, we're going to shift gears and we're going to go into action. On Thursday, Joy Donnell is going to be talking about how to be an effective ally, and we'll put together some concrete steps for doing that. And then on Friday, we will be working with you to develop a personal action plan, which you will develop privately, but we will give lots of information about what actions are available if you want to stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, if you want to become more active in terms of other issues you may be passionate about, and we will share some of our own experiences from the front lines of protest. This is a unique opportunity for us, and we're again so thankful that you are here today. And I want to jump right in. We'll start with a photo of, that's Nosh and I and other members, two other members of the research team in Washington, D.C., protesting in 2016. And as I said, you know, much of our work centers, many of us have been focused on other types of issues, LGBTQ plus representations, members involved in the fat acceptance movement, and many of us are involved in Black Lives Matter. So for example, we've been protesting on the ground, but also I did a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work in post-Katrina New Orleans. I co-founded the New Orleans Women's Shelter. I ran relief efforts after the hurricane. I worked to co-found the Lower Ninth Ward Living Museum, and I'm currently working with one of the 4 little girls who desegregated the Deep South in 1960. Her name is Miss Leona Tate, and we're opening the first civil rights museum in New Orleans. And as I mentioned, Nosh and I have done many actions together. So again, a confluence of our various interests here. So just to get things started, what is a social movement? We need a shared understanding of what we're talking about. So social movements are very purposeful, organized groups of people who come together for a common goal. Often that goal is about social justice, political, social, or economic progress. And when it comes to the effects of social movements, while they often don't achieve their goals immediately, we know that they have lasting effects on public awareness of problems. We, in social movements, end up passing laws, we shift institutions, and the activists who are involved in social movements themselves end up getting very politicized, especially if it happens when they're young and then they have a life of activism. So if you like the fact that you are not working on the weekends, you can thank the labor movement. If you like the fact that you can file a sexual harassment claim and now have new laws protecting you against retaliation, you can thank the Me Too movement. If you are LGBTQ plus and you are not worried about losing your job because of your sexual identity, you can thank the gay rights movement, which started with pretty violent riot and protest with the Stonewall exhibition in New York. So these social movements have brought about incredible social change. And in fact, if you look at the ways in which rights have expanded in the 240 years that we've been a country, you can identify the source of all of that progress as being social movements. That's where it begins. It's not necessarily where it ends. It takes a lot of different people. It takes policymakers, it takes activists, it takes everyday people. But at the end of the day, the data is solid that social movements make a difference. And within the next couple of hours, you are going to get readings for today. So if you would like to know more about the effectiveness, the data on the effectiveness of social movements, please consult that reading list. I want to focus specifically now on what is happening with Black Lives Matter and the push against the policing of Black bodies. I think it is very important to keep in mind the history of this, and I'm going to rush through this. We are packing a graduate seminar into 35 minutes so that we have time for questions. But we here in the United States, in America, have been policing Black bodies since before we were a country. In 1619, a group of about 20 enslaved people from the Angola region arrived at Point Comfort in Jamestown, Virginia. That was the first known shipment of enslaved people to what we now call the United States of America. And within a matter of decades, we had millions of enslaved people being brought to the continent in order to build the country. And make no doubt about it, enslaved Black people are the reason why the United States is an economic superpower. If you would like to know more about that, there will be a reading on the reading list. If you look at early policing and the origins of local police forces, it is important to keep in mind that they actually started as slave patrols. They emerged almost immediately in order to enforce slave codes. These were essentially, not law enforcement. They were just groups of white men who had compulsory service for a year or more and would patrol their local area and ensure that slaves were following slave codes. And then with the abolition, I'm jumping ahead here over a lot of history, which I hope you'll consult on the reading list. But the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, with the exception, you could enslave people as a punishment for a crime. And so that was immediately used as a loophole. So for example, it was immediately used as a loophole for local law enforcement to arrest recently freed Black people using petty codes and petty accusations. And so, for example, in Louisiana, in the prison, the Angola prison, which was called the bloodiest prison in America, it used to be a plantation, and you had enslaved Black people working that plantation. And then with the abolition, the formal abolition of slavery, you actually had police arresting recently freed Black people and sending them on petty charges and sending them back to work the Angola plantation. And I think that really embodies what Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary goes into. That is also on the reading list. So basically each of these bullet points could be, many, many months of reading on an issue. I'm just giving you an overview, but suffice it to say that with the abolition of slavery, we actually did not have total freedom. We actually had the re-enslavement of Black bodies. And it is important to note that when we formally abolished slavery with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War, slave patrols became local police forces. So if you want to know the origin and history of that, again, consult the reading list. I also want to reinforce the idea that historians have been saying for many decades, which is that racial inequality in the policing of Black bodies and the dehumanization of Black people in the United States of America was actually put into our founding documents by design. So for example, the Declaration of Independence in 1776 very overtly affirmed the right to life, liberty, and property for white men. And William Freeling is one of many historians who reaches the same conclusion, that the revolution actually opened the door just slightly for white men. It did not open the door for others. And in fact, the Declaration of Independence and the codification of Black Americans as 3/5 of human beings into the Constitution was actually a way of overtly maintaining slavery and putting down Native American resistance. And we see after the passage of the Constitution in 1789, just 1 year later, whiteness was actually established as a legal requirement for citizenship with the Immigration and Naturalization Act. So this wasn't accidental. It wasn't, it was something that was written into our founding documents. It was racial inequality by design. Now, since that time, social movements have made an incredible difference. We have made many steps toward racial equality with the abolitionist movement, the free produce movement, which were actually stores that were set up, made with goods that were not produced by slave labor. Of course, the Civil War. And then we have a series of Supreme Court cases that desegregated and executive orders that desegregated various aspects of our society in housing and education and marriage and relationships, and then in the military. And then we have the civil rights movement that started in the mid-1950s in earnest, and the Black Power movement led by Malcolm X and others, and then the Black Lives movement from 2013 to the present, which Dr. McTaggart will be talking about more specifically. So we have made incredible strides. But at the same time, racial inequality, the policing of Black bodies, and the dehumanization of Black Americans is an undeniable fact. And I'm going to share some data demonstrating that. I'm not going into data. I'm not presenting data on incarceration. I'm not presenting data on policing. I'm not presenting data on health disparities. I'm not presenting data on the fact that, you know, Black mothers and Black babies die many times over the rates of white mothers and white babies. I'm simply focusing on some economic statistics for time, but of course, consult the reading list. There is more information there. When it comes to looking at the inequalities that have been built into our culture with the policing of Black bodies and the codification, meaning writing into law racial inequality, we find that it has obvious political, social, and economic ramifications today. So for example, white wealth is, median wealth is many times, it's 10 times Black wealth in the United States. When it comes to income, the median income for Black households is almost twice that, almost half that of white households. Unemployment rates, and these are very current statistics. As you can see, the unemployment rate is very high right now, but it is much higher for Black Americans than it is for white Americans. It is no wonder then that rates of poverty are twice for Black Americans than what they are for white Americans. It is also no wonder that Black Americans are twice as likely to lack health insurance. And why does this matter? Well, the death rates, the likelihood of dying from COVID-19 is much higher for Black Americans than it is for white Americans. And we have a reading that goes into this on the reading list, but I'll just boil it down. The reason that this number is so much higher for Black Americans is threefold. One, Black Americans are less likely to have health insurance because of systemic and structural racism. Two, when Black Americans encounter the healthcare system, they are not treated in the same way as white Americans. Their pain and their suffering and their symptoms are not taken as seriously. And this is especially the case for Black women. And three, because of systemic structural racism, and which translates into economic outcomes, Black Americans have health problems that put them at a higher risk for COVID-19 fatality. So you can see that 400 years of policing Black bodies translates into Black Americans literally dying today. When we talk about what we can do about this, locations of racism, I think it's really important to really unpack the problem. Racism is not just an individual thing. It's not just racial slurs. It's not just one person engaging in disparaging or hateful acts against another person. That's individual level racism. It's also happening at systemic and in institutional levels. At the systemic level, these are rituals and beliefs and practices that uphold racism. So for example, racial stereotyping in media content would be an example of systemic racism. Or police profiling, even though technically it is illegal, it is widely practiced. So that would be an example of something that is not necessarily written into law, but it's a widespread practice. And then at the institutional level, we actually have laws in place that are racially biased and act in a racially biased fashion. So for example, the crack cocaine versus powder cocaine sentencing guidelines. Prior to President Obama getting into office, crack cocaine sentencing for the exact same amount was 100 times what it was for powder cocaine. Today, it's still 10 times as much, even though that's a major reform. So again, at the institutional level, these are laws that are put into place, state-sanctioned biases, and this can apply to any system of power, but we're focusing on race right now. Systemic would be the practices and beliefs that happen within institutions and within groups that end up perpetuating racism, and at the individual level, those would be individual actions that reflect and uphold racism. It's also important to keep in mind that there are different types of racism. So Jim Crow racism is what we think of when we think of using racial slurs, and we think of white people engaging in disparaging acts and hateful acts against Black people or people of color. So these are more overt acts. What happened with the civil rights movement is that we saw a decline in rates of Jim Crow racism amongst whites. But at the same time, we actually saw rates of different types or more covert types of racism go up, symbolic racism and colorblind racism, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But suffice it to say that the civil rights movement didn't make us less racist as a country, it just made whites better at hiding their racism. And we know that just based on Jim Crow racism rates going down and rates of symbolic and colorblind racism going up. So what are these forms of racism, these more hidden forms of racism? Well, the first, symbolic racism, is the belief that people of color violate basic American principles like hard work and independence. So for example, if you're a person with high levels of symbolic racism, you wouldn't say, I don't like Black people. What you would say is, I don't like lazy people and I think that Black people are lazy. So you would invoke a stereotype as a justification for your racism. But at the end of the day, it's still racism. Another form of racism that we've seen a dramatic increase in since the civil rights movement is colorblind racism. And this is a really common refrain. It's a denial that race privilege and discrimination exist. It's, for example, saying, oh, we've elected our first Black president, therefore racism is gone. When the data that I showed earlier and data that is in the reading list paint a very different picture, that racism and discrimination are alive and well. And if you've been watching your television screens for the last couple of weeks, you know that there are many cases of Black bodies being policed and being murdered. And there's no way to deny that racial privilege and discrimination exist. So now shifting, this is my last slide before Dr. McTaggart takes the baton. What is happening right now are the largest protests in US history. Not the largest in terms of numbers. Those happened in 2016 and 2017 with the Women's March, although I would anticipate that the Black Lives Matter movement, the cumulative numbers here will surpass that in probably a week. But it is the largest in terms of the number of states and cities involved. What we are seeing right now is monumental. We are seeing Black Lives Matter protests in white neighborhoods and predominantly white cities and white neighborhoods, which we've never seen before. We're seeing sustained protests in the same cities night after night, day after day. So what do Americans think about this? Well, 3/4 of Americans say that racism and discrimination is a serious problem, and this is a dramatic increase since 2015. Why the dramatic increase? I would argue that has everything to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, raising awareness about the policing and brutality against Black Americans. When asked in this representative sample what people think about the demonstrations that have taken place in the last 11 days, 57% of Americans say that demonstrators' anger is fully justified. Another 21% think that it is at least partially justified. We have never seen support like that across the board for these types of actions. And then when asked directly what people think about the Black Lives Matter movement, 6 in 10 Americans say that they support it. Again, the highest support for a movement for racial justice that we have seen in the United States. And I am now honored to turn the floor over to Dr. McTaggart, who is an expert on this issue, and we'll be talking more about the Black Lives Matter movement specifically.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm just setting up my screen. Okay, so first I wanted to start my presentation with some key terms for understanding racism, because I think that's important to frame the events of the last couple of weeks. For instance, cultural racism is the belief in society that one culture has superiority over another culture. Now, we used to, back before World War II, embrace biological theories of racism, that inherently people's brains were set up differently, and other biological forms were the cause of why people were inferior to others. Now it's more about cultural ideals. So the idea that, Blacks, let's say, for example, they have a culture of poverty. I've heard that one. Or something like they are inherently criminal or inherently lazy through their culture. So these are all examples of cultural racism. And with that, we also have white privilege, which is unearned advantages that white experience in racially stratified societies that go unnoticed or taken for granted. An example of this would be networks and corporations. So a group of white males might tell another white male that there is a job coming up and give him the first opportunity to apply for it before everyone else. Also important to note that with white privilege, the mainstream society, so here whites, expect other cultures to conform. However, they don't take into consideration or into account other aspects of other cultures to incorporate that into their own culture. As far as racial prejudice goes, it's a presumption made about an individual perceived characteristics in according to racial group membership. So this would include stereotyping. We see it sometimes in the media, and Dr. Heldman talked about it a little bit in her presentation. Stereotypes such as Blacks being criminals, drug dealers, athletes, so on and so forth in media. We also have internalized racism. This is when people of color internalize society's ideology that whiteness is a preferred norm. So an example of this could be internalizing, let's say, for Black women, wearing their hair natural versus wearing it in a straightened form, because certain instances in society discourage natural hair. That would be internalized racism if that person felt bad that wearing their hair natural. So I wanted to move on now that we have that foundation. I wrote about this in my scholarship, is the policing of Blacks engaged in everyday activities. Why I bring this to the forefront is I think it's important for us to know that this happens on a daily basis, and this happens to Black people who are doing everyday activities and just living their lives. These are the ones, I included a list of those reported to CNN in a 2018 study. So these are just the ones that were reported. I cut down the list significantly, actually. So I'll take a few examples here. Being a patient in a hospital. So this one had to do with a patient in Illinois who was in the hospital for asthma and pneumonia. His doctor recommended that he go take a walk outside the lobby. Then a white security guard called the cops on him because he thought he was going to steal the equipment and sell it on eBay. Mind you, this person, this man, this Black man had an IV running through him at that moment, although they still thought he was capable of theft. So why I bring that up is because in our most vulnerable moments, we are also still under attack, and we have to watch out for racial oppression at every corner. So I think that's important to note. A couple of other examples of brushing a backpack against a white woman. This happened to a Black child coming out of a deli in New York City. A white woman called the cops and falsely reported, that there was a sexual assault in progress. So not only are people reporting things, they're reporting false things. So that's important to note as well. If we look at the picture on the slide here, this pertains to the last point, which was the waiting for a meeting at a Starbucks. You probably heard about this in the news. It was a group of Black men who were waiting in a Starbucks for a business meeting to start. One of the employees asked them why they hadn't bought anything and that they had to leave because they hadn't purchased anything. And they were arrested actually because of this. I included this picture because there wasn't uprising among citizens, and this caused Starbucks to close down their stores, I believe, for diversity and inclusion training for all of their employees. And so this garnered a lot of media attention for that purpose. So my next slide talks about deputizing of civilians. We have here a picture of Barbecue Becky, as she was coined. It was in Oakland, California. A white woman called the cops on a group of Black people in a park who were barbecuing. And she claimed that, you know, you needed to have a license in order to use a charcoal barbecue. And this garnered a lot of media attention. And it's the idea that there's a hyper surveillance and control of Black bodies, the idea that whites can dictate where you can be, what you can be doing, and when you can be doing it. If it makes white people uncomfortable, then it becomes a problem and they can call in the police. We see that more recently, even you know, in the past few weeks in New York City. There was an incident in Central Park where a Black man was bird watching and a white woman had her dog off leash. He asked her to leash the dog and she refused, called the cops, and this was all videotaped as she also was mishandling and abusing her own dog in the whole process. We also see that white civilians take on a role of law enforcement. So it's the idea that now civilians feel like they're law enforcement, even though they don't have this authority. So if we take the Ahmaud Arbery case in the past few weeks as well, it's these 3 white men who feel like they can call the cops because a Black person is running in their neighborhood and they fear that that person is suspicious. They shouldn't be there. Engaging in a normal activity, exercising, working out. And obviously that led to his murder. So it's a very serious matter. We can also take George Zimmerman as an example in the Trayvon Martin case, also a deputized civilian. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what Black Lives Matters is. As Dr. Heldman pointed out, it began in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2013. This organization was co-founded by 3 Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrice Kahn-Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And they have a commitment to work vigorously for freedom and justice for Black people and by extension, all people. So they believe that by gaining justice and equality for Black people, we can all be free as human beings. And specifically, the group demands acknowledgement and accountability for devaluation and the dehumanization of Black people at the hands of police. And they fight to combat cases of anti-Black racism, not only here in America, but also globally. And we've seen that protests not only have increased significantly here, but we're seeing it globally now. We're seeing it in the UK, Australia, Berlin. So it's really becoming a global movement. So although we have Black Lives Matters, there are a couple of backlash movements that have also cropped up. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why these backlash movements are problematic. They are problematic because they reinforce a colorblind ideology. So the idea that you might have also heard the terminology post-racial. So the idea that we now live in a post-racial society where race doesn't matter and the focus is more on meritocracy, what you achieve, how hard you work. This is used also because of the fact that we have elected, our first Black president. It reduces the impact of systematic and institutional racism and oppression. So the idea that, it's only about individual racists. It's not about a system that encourages this racism or where this racism is entrenched. And it also dismisses the lived experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The idea that their pain and their suffering and their struggles don't matter as much, and they should be silenced because it makes other people uncomfortable. So now that we see this uptick in activism with Black Lives Matter movements, we also see that there has been a police response to that for being held accountable, for being called out on abuse of power and authority. So I think it's very ironic that as we protest the brutality of police forces, we see so many instances of people being brutalized as they protest peacefully. In Buffalo, New York, for example, there's a 75-year-old protester, Martin Gugino, who was pushed to the ground by 2 officers. He hit his head on the pavement and he started bleeding out on the pavement from his head. The rest of the force, I believe, just walked past him until state police actually came in to give him aid. These 2 officers have been charged, and their whole unit that was with them has resigned from that special force in protest for this punishment for their fellow officers or colleagues. Sarah Grossman, a recent Ohio State graduate, died after being tear gassed, and this eventually caused her to die of respiratory failure. So the use of tear gas and these types of tactics that are very dangerous can also not only harm you, but kill you. And then in Atlanta, we have a Spelman and Morehouse student driving near a protest who were also assaulted and tasered. These officers have faced arrests. And pointing out David McAtee in Louisville, he attended a protest and was shot by police because they heard a gunshot or in the crowd or thought they did. And his body was left in the streets for 13 hours afterwards. What's so important about this, and I'll talk about it later, is Louisville is the place where Breonna Taylor was murdered recently also by the police. So I'll talk about that later. We have also the use of long-range acoustic devices on protesters. So I have a little infographic down there. Essentially, these are sound cannons, and they can be very harmful to protesters. So if you're within 20 meters of this device, then it basically sounds like you are, a jet is taking off in front of you. So it's very dangerous. So I wanted to kind of wrap things up with the impact of Black Lives Matters. So what have we accomplished in the wake of the murder of George Floyd? All 4 officers have been charged in connection with his murder. So one of the officers is going to be charged with second-degree murder, and the other officers are being charged with aiding and abetting that second-degree murder. We have public schools in Minnesota and Parks and Recreation that are ending their contracts with the police. We have Confederate monument removal in Florida, Alabama, Virginia, Arkansas, Maryland. We also see removals of these types of statues abroad as well. Democrats and Republicans are beginning to push for a shutdown of a program that transfers military weaponry to local law enforcement. So the LRAD, like I just spoke about a minute ago, is an example of that weaponry that is now being sent to local police. In our own city, Mayor Garcetti announced $100 to $150 million cut from the LAPD budget. This is a great step in the right direction. However, it only equals to a 5% cut in what the LAPD will be getting for the year. Louisville mayor suspends no-knock warrants. These are basically Breonna Taylor. I'll tell you more about it if you don't know. She was killed in her sleep. Police had a no-knock warrant and shot into her apartment. She was murdered, and they had the wrong address, basically. So they went to the wrong place, and she ended up dying for that reason. As of yesterday, a majority of Minneapolis city council members announced their intent to disband police in favor of community-led public safety. So this is a huge step. And I will be talking about the movement to defund police in a minute. University of Kentucky removes mural, including images of enslaved Africans and Native Americans. So this had been a point of contention for years and years, and finally it is being removed. And then also, the NFL has apologized for silencing their players engaged in peaceful protests. So as all of you probably remember, Colin Kaepernick and other players in the league kneeled in silence against the oppression of Black people. And the NFL was was not supportive and actually condemned this behavior. So it is interesting now that they are apologizing and also announcing that they support that Black Lives Matter. So there has been a movement to defund the police. What that would mean would be reducing police budgets and power on both a local and state level in favor of investing those funds in public services, especially in communities of color, poor communities of color. So the redirection of resources would go into community-based initiatives. We'd implement non-police solutions to social problems. So we'd have anti-violence programs, after-school programs, trauma services, mental health counselors on call to de-escalate situations. And then this is very important because police budgets are consistently increased, but public institutions are slashed constantly. For instance, schools, hospitals, and libraries have their budgets slashed. I wanted to bring to light, if you didn't know, that medical personnel now don't have the proper PPE, especially in this time of the COVID epidemic. They're wearing trash bags as protective gear, or have to rely on citizens to send them masks and other PPE. Police are usually sent out to solve social problems without addressing the root causes. So instead of addressing our homelessness issue in Los Angeles, a lot of times cops are called out for that reason. And if we had just adopted a way to end homelessness or work on that problem, the cops would not be needed for that. And also, when crime happens, right, it's a response to social conditions. So if we have less services for the people of those communities, crime is going to increase. And when they have the services they need, they feel uplifted, they feel supported, crime will also naturally tend to decrease. So we wanted to end our presentation with this slide. Silence is violence and Black lives matter. So we're really excited about this week of lectures, our social justice teach-in, the idea that we want to provide some resources and information for you all to make changes in your community, to join in this activism, and we want to give you those tools to allow that to happen.
Okay, so we are going to open it up to questions that Dr. McTaggart and I are happy to respond to. You can direct them at both of us or one of us. I know that one question has been submitted so far. Rebecca Cooper asks, can you elaborate on why you think public support for the current Black Lives Matter social movement looks so much better than 2015? And how do these public opinion numbers look compared to the civil rights movement in the 1960s? Do you want to take that question first, Dr. McTaggart?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll take the first half of that. So why does the Black Lives Matter social movement look so much better than 2015? I definitely believe the health crisis that we're in with COVID-19 has actually helped to fuel this movement. If you think about it, people are fed up. People are losing their jobs. Unemployment rates are very high. People are in quarantine, they're home. They're not in their traditional jobs or workplaces. So I think that allows for people to be able to go out into the streets and protest, and also give a little bit more time to look into resources for activism and allow people to be more active in their communities generally.
And I can answer the second one. I'm actually looking at specific data, Gallup data. So the second part of the question is how the numbers today compare to numbers during the civil rights movement. And so in February of 1965, so if you remember, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is in the heart of the civil rights movement where progressive action has been taken. 26% of Americans said that racism was a serious problem facing the nation. So 26%. Compare that to 76% today who say that it is a major issue. And I should take a step back and say education is not enough. Education is not enough to bring about the sort of change we need, but it is a necessary first step. So having 3/4 of Americans who now believe that racism, specifically racism aimed at Black people, is a problem compared to just 1 in 4 Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. This is a dramatic shift, and a dramatic shift in the positive direction. So Dr. McTaggart talked about how, the defund the police movement and how this has been really controversial. And it's interesting, in the city of Camden, they actually did a defund law enforcement or defund local police movement a few years ago, and they found a 50% decrease in crime, and they actually found that a number of other indicators improved, so quality of life, even participation in high school completion rates and other indicators of a community health. So it's these ideas that were radical, or radical maybe even 5 or 10 years ago, are now being bandied about in the public space, because we understand that it's not enough to just have education, right? So for example, in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered by police, they had cutting edge training and awareness programs for their police officers. And granted, that's one anecdote, but we know across the nation that these training programs, while they have made some difference, they have not eliminated the racism that is perhaps inherent in a police force that originated from slave patrols.
I think we have another question I just saw that came in, Caroline. So it's to ask, what can we do if we can't protest because we are caretakers? And if you don't mind, I'll take that question, just because that is exactly the position I'm in. I am a caretaker for my mother, one of the caretakers for my mother. So I haven't been protesting due to concerns about COVID-19 and possibly infecting her if I get sick. So there's so much we can do. We're going to actually talk about this more on Friday. We have a whole lecture devoted to that. But a couple things that come off the top of my head that we can do, and what I've been doing, is I've been calling public officials. I've been emailing them, both locally and also in other states, in response to Breonna Taylor's murder, Ahmaud Arbery's murder, George Floyd's murder. So I've been calling public officials. I've also been donating to causes. There's so many resources out there. There's the ACLU is one that I can think of, change.org. There's petitions that can be signed. Do you have any others, Caroline, that you want to?
Yes, so much we can do. And just to echo what Dr. McTaggart said, this entire week is building up to that. So I have already had COVID-19. I have the antibodies. So I'm on the front lines. Been arrested a couple times this week in very peaceful demonstrations. And I will say it has been, I don't want to make it about me, but it's been a scary experience to be protesting police brutality and have so much police brutality meted back at peaceful protesters. But I would strongly encourage people to participate in protests now, because the police are being much more brutal in Los Angeles a week ago than they are today. But there's so many different things, right? So Dr. McTaggart talked about contacting public officials. I think as content creators, we have a special obligation to tell stories that disrupt racist narratives and not reinforce racist stereotypes. And we will talk a lot about that on Thursday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And just to tie it back into this, there is a question. Historically, has entertainment media played an impactful role in the advancements of past social movements? Absolutely. I would argue, and as other scholars have argued, especially recently, we've seen social movements actually sparked by media. So for example, Gasland was the first documentary that got us talking about fracking, which became an international and now a global movement against fracking for environmental reasons. Blackfish, a documentary, launched a movement against companies that have, orcas and other sentient, highly intelligent mammals who are caged in places. And in fact, SeaWorld has radically shifted. I mean, they no longer have orcas in captivity, or they're not bringing in new orcas into captivity, and are donating a lot of money to restoring them in the wild. Super Size Me, another documentary, got us focused on fast food and dramatically changed the fast food industry. So now we have, salads at McDonald's and healthy offerings at many fast food outlets. So, and I know some of these are less important, I would say, than something like racial justice and stopping policing Black bodies. But at the end of the day, if you look at 13th, if you look at When They See Us, all of these have had a profound effect on raising awareness about police brutality and policing in recent years. Media focus on Rodney King and all the media content that came out of that. And perhaps, Dr. McTaggart, you have some other examples of how Hollywood has been positive and instrumental in social change.
I just think maybe for me personally, I'm thinking like Bowling for Columbine it was personally hit me and taught me so much with as far as the push for gun control and I know this film had been made long ago and we still have these issues, but I think it definitely put it into the mainstream and put it into focus. So that's something that comes off the top of my head right now.
Another question has come in. Can you please explain the harmful practice of tokenizing the labor of minorities and Black, Indigenous, and people of color by companies? Would you like to tackle that first, Dr. McTaggart, or would you like me to?
You can begin.
Okay, so the practice of tokenizing is, for folks who are unfamiliar with that term, means that you're hiring people so that they optically look great, right? So maybe you put them on a board or in a prominent position, but then their voices are not heard or they don't actually have authority. And I think a great example of this is the National Organization for Women this week has come under strong scrutiny. And in fact, there's a call to shake up the leadership because although women of color, Native American, Latinx, and Black women were brought into leadership positions, their voices were not heard. So this practice has been around for decades, ever since we started to prioritize better representation of women, people of color, and other marginalized groups in corporations and in nonprofits, and it does incredible damage to advancing the cause because it looks like you're advancing, it looks like you're listening to and representing the interests of people who are marginalized. So it's a double silencing in that sense. Also, it's I think in Hollywood, especially the case, I mean, even in media representation, right, where when we're doing our analysis of content, we're looking at, that basically the token representation of marginalized identities in media content, so perhaps people of color or LGBTQ plus, or people with large body types are showing up more, but they're also showing up in very stereotypical ways, which is it's a tokenizing in media content. And so, yeah, I would bring this back for a moment to say that the entire goal of this week is, if you're a white person, that you become empowered with knowledge and information about how to be a great ally, so that you're not engaging in performative or optical allyship. And we actually have a reading on our reading list today for that, and we'll address that in greater detail on Thursday. And if you are a Black person or an Indigenous person or a person of color, you do not bear the burden of educating white people about this, and also that we all learn effective tactics given our different place in the movement and what we can do, given our resources and our access to making content or getting involved in other ways, that we do that in the most effective way possible. Question whether or not this will be available. The slide, yes, the slide will be available. The video will be available. There's the slide deck as well as the reading list. We have another question here. What is the best source to understand the stance of Black Lives Matter? Where to send others for information or to learn more about the movement? Dr. McTaggart?
We are actually going to put that in our resource list. I believe it's there already. But if you just Google Black Lives Matter, the website for the organization, I think, is the most direct source. People can find out more information there, more about what the ideals they stand for, and how they are participating in the recent protests that have been going on in this country in the last few weeks, and also since 2013.
Another question, has there been a formalized movement to address systemic racism and widespread abuse of power in high school and collegiate elite athletics? For example, recruiting of Black players and profiting off their work or their bodies with a promise of a brighter future? I don't know. Do you know, Dr. McTaggart?
It doesn't ring a bell for me. Not that I'm aware of, but we can take note of that and check.
And we'll add it to the resources, which is precisely why they're not coming to you for another couple of hours, so we can work and respond to questions. So we will get that information. We'll add it to the resources if that indeed exists. Another question, how do you suggest speaking to colleagues who don't get it and the environment doesn't allow for safely speaking up? There are ongoing microaggressions in my workplace and I want to speak up for the right thing, but I fear for my job security. So I can address this. So for folks, I'll address it first. If you want to address it second, Dr. McTaggart.
Sounds great.
Okay. One thing that we need to know what microaggressions are. This may not be familiar to everyone, but microaggressions are everyday acts of racism based upon identity. So a microaggression might be, for example, when a young Black person goes into a store, they might be followed around with the idea that they are a high risk for shoplifting. In the workplace, microaggressions might be something as simple as saying, wow, you're really articulate, which suggests that the expectation is that you wouldn't be articulate. So language use, not respecting people's opinions. So everyday actions that aren't necessarily overtly aggressive, although some of them could be, but they're more passive but still have the same damaging effect. Did you want to address the other part of the question, Dr. McTaggart?
Let's see. I was just going to add one more thing about microaggressions. Just another example that came to me, but I study Asian Americans as well, and the question, oh, where are you from? So the idea that for Asian Americans and the stereotype of a forever foreigner. So it's the idea that you are Asian American, but still are stereotyped as being a foreigner or an outsider.
One last question. How do we talk to our kids about this? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to address the second part of the question?
Oh, yes. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was just how can you speak up? The person that asked the question, they were fearful for their job. I would say it's a tough one because this is a situation a lot of people face. I would say if they're in your HR department, I don't know if you can use that as a source of safety in your company, but hopefully your company would push for, and maybe this recent activism will help that, push for more resources that are diverse and inclusive. So maybe not having to directly do it yourself, but hopefully have someone in your company maybe to be a person to provide those resources and information to others.
There are 3 more questions, but we are out of time. But I will say the first is, how do we talk to our kids about this? There's actually a link already in our reading list about how to talk to kids about racism and what is happening right now from the American Association of Pediatrics. The second is, I'm wondering how gun control fits in here, as the militarization of police and white militias are often defended with the argument that they're just protecting themselves from possible gun violence. We do have some links about the process, not of abolishing law enforcement or the police, but defunding, which is different. It's about shifting resources. And so it addresses that issue. And then the third, can you speak on the policy of incentivized policing, quotas, et cetera, how that plays a role in the current social movements and how it differs from the concept of protect and serve and a traditional idea of policing in the US. We will include a reading about that, as well as, we don't have that now, but we'll include a reading on that, as well as a reading on high school and collegiate athletes. I have a couple of housekeeping things. So resources will be sent out in the next few hours along with this survey. We're going to be surveying you each day to see how we can improve these teach-ins. Tomorrow's topic is gender and race codes in early Hollywood with Dr. Nicole Haggard and Monica Lay. And this, again, it's going to be a data-driven but compelling presentation on how gender and race codes in early Hollywood are still shaping content today. And we really want to stress that the goal is to move away from optical allyship or optical participation in social movements and make our allyship and our participation more effective. And I just want to say that I am honored to share the virtual platform with Dr. Ninochka McTaggart. And if you can, go purchase her book, White Privilege, The Persistence of Racial Hierarchy in a Culture of Denial. Thank you so much, and we will see you tomorrow.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.